He was blind from birth, but he saw through the lies of love, lust, and heartbreak clearer than most. With a deep southern growl and lyrics too raw for radio, Clarence Carter made you cry with Patches and blush with Strokin. He sold millions of records, but the industry never gave him his flowers. So why has one of soul music's most daring voices been left out of history books? This is the Clarence Carter story, the genius they never dared to celebrate. From the very first note of his career, Clarence stood apart. He didn't look like the image of a polished crooner that record executives wanted to promote. He didn't sing the kind of carefully packaged ballads that could slip easily into radio playlists. Instead, he sang about the rawest parts of life, about the messiness of relationships, the pain of betrayal, the heat of desire, and the burden of poverty. His voice, gravelly yet tender, wasn't just a sound, it was a confession. Each growl carried the weight of a man who had lived through every lyric. And yet, despite creating songs that crossed racial lines, selling gold records, and penning one of the most heartbreaking R&B ballads of the 20th century, Clarence Carter's name never rose to the level of his peers. He wasn't honored at award shows, wasn't celebrated with tributes, and never found his place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. To some, he was too real, too unfiltered, too unwilling to compromise. To others, he was simply overlooked, a casualty of an industry that only rewards what it can neatly package and sell. But make no mistake, Clarence Carter mattered. His music gave people a voice when they had none, a laugh when life felt unbearable, and a cry when grief became too heavy. He was proof that soul was never about perfection. It was about truth. So, how does a man who sold millions, who wrote anthems still sung today, end up as a footnote in music history? Was Clarence Carter truly underrated, or was he dismissed because he dared to be himself? That's the question at the heart of this story, the story of a blind man from Montgomery who turned pain into poetry, lust into laughter, and struggle into song. Clarence George Carter entered the world on the 14th of January 1936 in Montgomery. Being born black in the segregated South was already a heavy strike against him. But Clarence faced another challenge that set him apart even further. He was blind from birth. In a time when segregation laws defined daily life, when poverty ran deep across the South, and when opportunities for young black children were almost non-existent, being both black and blind meant Clarence began life carrying an almost unbearable weight. For most, those circumstances might have been but for Clarence, blindness wasn't a sentence. It became a sharpening stone. While his eyes could not see, his ears became his guide to the world, and sound became the lens through which he experienced life. Montgomery, in the 1,940 seconds, was alive with music. Gospel rang out of churches, full of shouts, wails, and the trembling power of voices lifted toward heaven. Blues crept through the doors of smoky juke joints and spilled into the streets with the groan of guitars and the steady pulse of rhythm. Clarence absorbed it all. As a child, he pressed himself close to the crackle of old records, memorizing every nuance. He studied the way John Lee Hooker bent a note until it moaned, how Lightnin' Hopkins could make silence ache, and how Jimmy Reed's voice carried both humor and sorrow in the same breath. Without sight to distract him, he understood that music wasn't just melody. It was a conversation between sound and silence, between the instrument and the heart. That obsession with listening became his education. Clarence taught himself guitar not by watching, but by imitating, by tracing every detail of what he heard. Slowly, he began to innovate, not only recreating the licks of bluesmen he admired, but shaping them into something of his own. Music became more than entertainment. It was language, direction, free. It gave him a way to exist beyond the labels society pinned on him: poor, black, blind. With each note, he carved out an identity bigger than his circumstances. Life outside of music, however, remained difficult. In Montgomery, Clarence's disability often left him invisible to the world. Opportunities were scarce, and prejudice came from every side: racial prejudice from a white-majority society that viewed black citizens as second class, and social prejudice from a culture that assumed blindness meant helplessness. But Clarence never saw himself as a victim. Instead, he leaned into his sharpened sense of hearing, into the music that seemed to follow him. By the time he was a teenager, Clarence's reputation as a determined musician was beginning to form in his community. Neighbors remembered the boy who could sit for hours, strumming and listening, locked in a world of sound. He wasn't simply passing time. He was building the foundation for a career that, though unimaginable to most around him, was already taking shape in his mind. For Clarence, every day was practice in resilience. Every blues line he played was proof that he could create beauty in spite of struggle. Every gospel hymn that rang in his ears reminded him that despair wasn't the only option. From his earliest years, Clarence Carter wasn't just surviving his blindness and his circumstances, he was turning them into tools. The child who couldn't see the world was already preparing to remake it in song. When Clarence was old enough, his life took a pivotal turn. He was sent to the Alabama School for the Blind in Talladega, one of the few places in the South where a blind child could find an environment tailored to his needs. For the first time, Clarence wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Surrounded by other students who faced similar challenges, he discovered a space that didn't define him by what he lacked, but instead emphasized what he could achieve. At Talladega, Clarence found he was no longer learning by ear alone. Now he was being taught theory, composition, and technique. Perhaps most transformative of all, he learned to read and write music in Braille. This opened a world of possibility. No longer limited to imitation, Clarence could now translate the melodies in his head into structured compositions. Blindness, instead of being a barrier, became a discipline that forced him to be deliberate, patient, and he began mastering multiple instruments, experimenting with sounds and arrangements. Teachers noticed his focus, the way he could sit for hours working through a piece until he had squeezed out every detail. That diligence was rooted not just in passion but in necessity. For Clarence, music wasn't a hobby, it was survival, a way to prove he belonged in a world eager to dismiss him. By the late 1950s, Clarence's determination carried him further than most. He enrolled at Alabama State College, now Alabama State University, and pursued a Bachelor of Science degree in music. This was no small feat. For a black man in the Jim Crow South, higher education itself was a hurdle. For a blind black man to graduate with a music degree in 1960 was nothing short of extraordinary. That diploma symbolized more than academic success. It was a declaration that Clarence Carter would not be confined by the narrow roles. Many assumed he would become a music teacher or play locally, perhaps leading a church choir or a small band. But Clarence's ambition reached beyond the safety of classrooms and community stages. He wanted to make records. He wanted to step into studios, to put his voice on vinyl, and to let the world hear the stories only he could tell. Around this time, he began to meet other musicians with similar dreams, among them a fellow blind artist named Calvin Scott. Their connection would set the stage for the next chapter of Clarence's journey. Together, they would test the limits of what two young black men without sight but full of soul and hunger could do in a music industry that was stacked against them. Looking back, it's clear that Clarence's early life was both burden and blessing. The hardship of blindness in the segregated South could have silenced him. Instead, it tuned him like an instrument, refining his ear, sharpening his discipline, and fueling a determination that would carry him into the storm of the music industry. By the time he left Alabama State College, Clarence Carter was no longer just a boy with a guitar, he was an artist in waiting, ready to fight for his place on the stage. By the early 1960s, Clarence Carter had armed himself with an education and an unshakable determination to break into the music industry. But diplomas didn't open doors in Montgomery, and the industry didn't roll out red carpets for blind black musicians from Alabama. What Clarence did find was a partner, a kindred spirit named Calvin Scott. Like Clarence, Calvin was blind. Like Clarence, he was hungry to prove himself through. Together they became Clarence and Calvin, later known as the C&C Boys. From the moment they joined forces, there was a chemistry between them that couldn't be faked. They weren't polished in the way mainstream labels demanded, but they had something far more powerful: grit, soul, and the refusal to be pitied. Each man understood the other's struggle, and together they carried themselves with a quiet. The duo hustled the way countless Southern musicians had to in that era, one night in a VFW hall, the next at a high school dance, and then maybe a juke joint that smelled of sweat and smoke. The pay was meager. Some nights they earned $20, some nights nothing at all. but every performance felt like one step closer to breaking through. Clarence believed that even in those dimly lit rooms, someone important. Their repertoire mixed gospel-infused harmonies with down-home blues grit. Audiences responded to the raw energy, even if local radio stations didn't. They scraped together enough money to record a few sides for small labels like Fairlane and Duke Records. Tracks like I Wanna Dance, But I Don't Know How, and Step by Step showcased their talent, but the singles barely moved beyond Alabama. They didn't chart. They didn't get airplay. To the industry, but to the musicians who heard them, something was brewing. What they lacked in polish, they more than made up for in feeling. Clarence's voice was already showing the qualities that would later make him unmistakable, soulful, gritty, and commanding. The way he sang, you didn't just hear the notes, you felt the life behind them. Word began to spread among local musicians that these two blind men were worth paying attention to. By the mid-1960 seconds, whispers of opportunity began pointing toward Muscle Shoals, Alabama. At the time, Muscle Shoals wasn't yet a legend, but it was quickly becoming a magnet for talent. Fame Studios, run by producer Rick Hall, was a scrappy little operation that didn't care about race or image, it cared about sound. It was one of the rare places in Alabama where white and black musicians created side by side, even as the state around them fought bitterly to maintain. For Clarence and Calvin, Fame Studios represented possibility. They made their way there, carrying only their instruments, their voices, and their determination. Rick Hall saw something in Clarence immediately. He didn't just hear a unique voice, he heard a storyteller, a man who could take everyday pain and translate it into melody. The C&C Boys recorded tracks like I'm Depending on You at Fame, showcasing their gospel roots. The records didn't hit the charts, but they solidified Clarence's connection to the Muscle Shoals scene. For the first time, he wasn't just singing into the void, he was inside a studio where magic was happening, where the seeds of Southern soul were being planted. It was the beginning of a relationship that would define his career. Still, fate had a cruel twist waiting. In 1966, Calvin Scott was involved in a devastating car accident that left him severely injured and unable to perform. The accident brought their partnership to an abrupt end. For Clarence, it was a crushing blow. He lost not only his partner but also the dream they had been building together. Standing at that crossroads, he could have stepped back, given in to grief, and settled into obscurity. But Clarence Carter wasn't built for retreat. Alone now, he tightened his grip on his guitar, returned to Fame Studios, and told Rick Hall he had heartbreak, humor, and wisdom etched into his voice, and he was determined to let the world hear it. What came next would mark the true beginning of Clarence Carter's rise. With Calvin Scott sidelined after the car accident, Clarence Carter faced a lonely horizon. The safety net of partnership was gone. Yet instead of folding under the weight of loss, he marched back into Fame Studios with determination burning hotter than ever. He wasn't just another hopeful anymore. He was a man who had paid his dues in back rooms and dance halls, a man who had seen doors slammed in his face, and he was ready to claim his place. Clarence approached Rick Hall with a clear message. He wanted to record as a solo artist. Hall, always with an eye for raw talent, gave him the chance. Clarence poured his life into a new track called Tell Daddy. It was funky, pleading, and painfully honest. The song told the story of a man who knows his lover is cheating and begs her to With Hall's production and Clarence's raspy, soulful delivery, Tell Daddy cut through the noise of polite radio. Released in 1967, the single became Clarence Carter's first taste of real chart success, climbing to number 35 on the R&B chart. It wasn't a smash, but it was enough to make the industry take notice. More importantly, it revealed Clarence's strength as a songwriter. His lyrics weren't abstract or polished to perfection. They were plain-spoken truths. He wrote about betrayal and desperation the way people actually lived them. Then came the twist of fate that would amplify Clarence's name even further. Legendary soul singer Etta James heard Tell Daddy and recognized its potential. She recorded a fiery female response called Tell Mama using Clarence's original instrumental track. Her version exploded, becoming a massive hit and cementing its place in soul history. While James took the spotlight, Clarence gained something just as valuable, songwriting credit. Suddenly, his name was associated with one of the hottest records of the year. That breakthrough changed everything. Clarence Carter was no longer just a backwoods Alabama singer with a gravelly voice, he was a proven hitmaker. His ability to capture raw human emotion in a few verses made him stand out in a crowded field of soul singers. He could pen a song that another artist could turn into a smash, and that meant he had currency in the industry. By the end of 1967, Clarence's persistence paid off in the biggest way yet. Atlantic Records came calling. This was the same label that carried titans like Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. Signing with Atlantic wasn't just a career move, it was validation that the blind boy from Montgomery had arrived. He had clawed his way from invisible club gigs to the roster of one of the most powerful labels in soul music. The Atlantic deal positioned Clarence for bigger opportunities, but it also raised the stakes. He could no longer afford to be ignored. He was stepping into the spotlight, and with that came the pressure to prove he wasn't a one-hit wonder. With the Muscle Shoals musicians behind him and Rick Hall guiding the sessions, Clarence Carter was preparing to unleash songs that would not only chart, but also carve out a permanent space in the soul canon. Looking back, it's clear that this was the true turning point in Clarence's career. The long nights playing for pennies, the failed singles, the endless rejections, all of it led to this moment. Clarence had earned his shot, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He had the stories, the voice, and the determination. Now, he had the platform. As 1968 dawned, Clarence Carter was no longer hustling in obscurity. He was poised to step into his breakthrough years, ready to show the world that his voice could move not just small crowds in Alabama, but millions across the nation. What came next would transform him from a regional act into a household name and prove that grit and honesty could stand toe-to-toe with polished perfection. When Clarence Carter walked into the studio in 1968 as a newly signed artist with Atlantic Records, he carried more than just a guitar and a gritty voice. He carried years of rejection, hunger, and determination. Now, backed by the power of one of the most influential labels in soul music and the magic of Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, he was finally positioned to show the world what he could do. And when the world heard what he recorded, it couldn't turn away. That year, Clarence cut a track that would become his signature, and his first true crossover hit Slip Away. From the opening groove, the song dripped with sensuality. Built on a slow-burning rhythm with a sultry bass line and a simmering organ, Slip Away wasn't just another soul record. It was Southern soul distilled into pure emotion. Clarence's raspy, aching voice told the story of a forbidden love affair, of a woman trapped in a troubled marriage and the man offering comfort in secret. The subject was daring for its time. Infidelity wasn't something pop radio wanted to play, but Clarence delivered it with such vulnerability that it became more than scandal, it became relatable. When he sang, "Let me come on back, baby, I want to slip away," he wasn't just playing the part of a cheating man, he was confessing the loneliness, the longing, and the messy truths that audiences lived, but rarely heard acknowledged in song. The single rocketed to number 2 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 6 on the pop chart. It sold over 1 million copies, earning Clarence his first gold record. For the blind singer from Montgomery, this wasn't just success, it was validation. After years of struggling in the shadows, Clarence Carter was suddenly everywhere. His voice was on radios in black neighborhoods and white suburbs alike, blasting from car windows, jukeboxes, and living rooms across America. He had broken down racial and genre barriers, not with crossover gimmicks or slick image-making, but with raw feeling, and he wasn't done. Riding the momentum, Clarence released another single later that same year, Too Weak to Fight. This song reinforced everything that made Slip Away powerful emotional honesty, a groove soaked in Southern soul, and lyrics that Too Weak to Fight climbed to number 3 on the R&B chart and number 13 on the pop chart, earning Clarence a second gold record. 2 million selling singles in the same year established him not as a fluke but as a genuine force in the industry. By now, Clarence Carter's brand was clear. He wasn't about smooth surfaces or sanitized emotions. He was about truth, however uncomfortable. Songs like Snatching It Back and Making Love at the Dark End of the Street continued this tradition, blending the grit of the South with themes of desire, betrayal, and heartache. While other artists leaned into the glossy, radio-friendly sound of Motown, Clarence stuck to his roots. He sang about the shadows, the flaws, and the contradictions of human relationships. Even his experiments showed his refusal to play by them. In 1968, he recorded Backdoor Santa, a raunchy, funky Christmas track that turned the holiday genre on its head. With its brassy swagger and innuendo-filled lyrics, it wasn't destined for mainstream radio, but it became a cult classic. Years later, it would be resurrected when Run DMC sampled it for their holiday anthem Christmas in Hollis, giving Clarence Carter an unlikely place in hip-hop history. What made Clarence unique during this breakout period wasn't just his chart success, it was the texture of his voice. His singing was rough, flawed, and utterly human. He didn't sound like a polished crooner or a pop puppet. He sounded like a man at the end of the bar who had lived through every heartbreak, every betrayal, and every stolen kiss he sang about. He could be tender in one verse and downright nasty in the next, but through it all, he remained believable. Audiences connected because they felt the man behind the microphone wasn't pretending. By 1969, Clarence Carter was a household name in Black America and an undeniable presence in the broader soul genre. His records sold, his songs resonated, and his voice cut through the polished veneer of mainstream radio like sandpaper on silk. He had earned his spot, not by cleaning himself up to fit industry expectations, but by doubling down on the truth of who he was. But even as he celebrated his newfound success, Clarence was already thinking about how to go deeper. His songs had made people dance, laugh, and blush. Now he wanted to make them cry. He wanted to write something that went beyond lust and longing, something that could move not just hips but hearts. That ambition would soon give birth to the most heartbreaking and career-defining song of his life, a song called Patches. By the dawn of the 1,970 seconds, Clarence Carter had already proven himself a chart-topping artist. With Slip Away and Too Weak to Fight, he had become a household name, admired for his rawness and emotional honesty. But Clarence wasn't content with just making people dance or blush. He wanted to create something deeper, something that could stop listeners in their tracks and pull tears from their eyes. That moment came in 1970 with a song that would change his career. Patches was unlike anything Clarence had released before. The song told the story of a poor black boy whose father dies, leaving him to shoulder the responsibility of holding his family together. The lyrics were plain-spoken, almost conversational, but that simplicity was their strength. "I'm depending on you, son, to pull the family through." It was not clever poetry, it was devastating truth. Clarence poured himself into the performance. Every syllable carried the weight of grief, duty, and the suffocating pressure of becoming a man too soon. Listeners wept. This was not just soul music, it was Southern storytelling at its rawest, rooted in gospel tradition and the generational trauma of poverty. For audiences who had lived through similar struggles, the song felt like their own story finally given a voice. For others, it was an unflinching look into a world of hardship that they rarely acknowledged. Patches transcended race, class, and geography. The song became Clarence Carter's biggest crossover hit. It reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 2 in the UK, and sold over 1 million copies. In 1971, it earned Clarence a Grammy Award for Best R&B Song. It was the ultimate validation, the industry's acknowledgement that this blind singer from Montgomery had created something timeless. For a brief moment, Clarence Carter stood shoulder to, but just as quickly, his story grew complicated. Because while Patches showcased his ability to deliver heart-wrenching storytelling, Clarence was still the same man who loved writing songs full of innuendo, lust, and humor. Even as he performed Patches to audiences in tears, he continued to release tracks like The Feeling Is Right and Doing Our Thing, songs soaked in sexual tension and funk-driven swagger. This duality became Clarence's trademark and his birth. Some critics couldn't reconcile it. How could the man who sang so poignantly about fatherhood and poverty also record songs that sounded like they belonged in the back room of a juke joint? Was he a lyrical genius or a dirty old man? Depending on who you asked, Clarence Carter was both. This paradox made him polarizing, and while it endeared him to fans who loved his honesty, it alienated radio programmers and critics who preferred their soul singers, yet Clarence never apologized for who he was. In interviews, he defended his lyrical choices bluntly. "I sing what I know," he said. "I know about women. I know about making love. and I know what it feels like when you're broke and heartbroken. That was Clarence's philosophy. Truth, whether it made people cry or laugh, whether it was praised or condemned. Behind the bravado, though, Clarence remained. In the studio, he was meticulous, arranging his music in braille and directing sessions with a precision that demanded respect. He knew exactly what he wanted from his musicians and was never satisfied until the song matched the sound in his head. His blindness was never an excuse. If anything, it made him sharper, more deliberate, more disciplined. Despite his reputation for raunchiness, Clarence's albums from the early 1970 seconds continued to sell. Patches, the dynamic Clarence Carter, and 60 Minutes with Clarence Carter all kept him relevant and respected. But the tide of soul music was shifting, funk was rising, disco was on the horizon, and the sweaty, gritty brand of Southern soul that Clarence embodied was beginning to feel old-fashioned to radio programmers and record executives. Even so, Clarence Carter's run from 1968 to 1971 marked the pinnacle of his mainstream career. In just a few years, he had gone from hustling in Alabama clubs to topping international charts and winning a Grammy. He had proven himself a hitmaker, a storyteller, and an artist who refused to compromise. But that same refusal to compromise, the very thing that made him authentic, would also set him on a collision course with an industry obsessed with trends and image. As the decade moved forward, Clarence would find himself fighting to hold on to the spotlight he had fought so hard. The world that had once embraced his honesty would begin to turn its back. And yet, true to form, Clarence Carter wasn't about to stop being Clarence Carter. His voice would continue to growl, confess, and seduce, even as the world around him shifted to shinier, smoother sounds. The 1970 seconds opened, with Clarence Carter at the peak of his powers. Patches had crossed boundaries, touched millions, and won him a Grammy. His records were selling, his name was recognized, and his voice, gritty, raw, unpolished, was impossible to ignore. But with success came scrutiny, and Clarence soon found himself walking a tightrope between adoration and rejection. The very qualities that made him authentic, his blunt lyrics, his willingness to sing about lust and betrayal, were also what made him controversial. Critics couldn't decide what to make of him. Some called him a lyrical genius, praising his ability to distill pain into plain-spoken poetry. Others dismissed him as crude, a novelty act, a man too willing to wallow in the gutter. Radio programmers hesitated. A heartfelt ballad like Patches might get heavy rotation, but songs like The Feeling Is Right or Doing Our Thing made them nervous. Was Clarence Carter too real for mainstream radio? The industry was confused, but Clarence wasn't. He knew exactly who he was, and he refused to change. "I sing what I know," he explained in interviews. That meant he sang about women, about making love, about heartbreak, and about being broke. These weren't abstract metaphors, they were the lived realities of people in his community. He gave voice to feelings that polite society pretended didn't exist. And while that honesty resonated deeply with fans, it also made him an easy target for those who wanted soul music to be smoother, safer, more marketable. Behind the raunchy lyrics and bold persona, Clarence Carter was a craftsman of the highest order. In the studio, he was relentless. He arranged his music in braille, meticulously mapping out each part. He directed sessions with precision, demanding that musicians capture exactly the sound he envisioned. There was no room for mediocrity. Clarence knew how to push, when to pull back, and when to let silence speak louder than words. His blindness wasn't a limitation, it was a discipline. It forced him to listen more deeply, to feel the subtleties others overlooked. Every growl, every whisper, every shout was intentional. That perfectionism extended to his live performances. Even in small clubs and modest venues, Clarence gave everything he had. He might not have been the flashiest performer, but his voice carried the room. Audiences believed him because he sang as if he had lived every line, and in many cases, he had. Still, despite his dedication, Clarence couldn't control the tides of the music industry. The early 1970 seconds were a period of transition. Funk was rising, with its driving bass lines and danceable grooves. Disco was just around the corner, bringing slick production and choreographed spectacle. Soul music was evolving, and Clarence's brand of sweaty, gritty, Southern storytelling was starting to sound old-fashioned to executives chasing the next big trend. Yet Clarence's albums continued to sell. The dynamic Clarence Carter and 60 Minutes with Clarence Carter kept him on the charts, proving that fans weren't ready to let go. He had a loyal base who loved him precisely because he didn't fit the mold. But while those albums sustained his career, the momentum of the late 1960 seconds began to slow. The mainstream spotlight that had once burned bright was dimming. For Clarence, the conflict was clear. He could either reinvent himself to fit the industry's shifting expectations or stay true to the man he had always been. Reinvention, however, was never in his nature. Clarence Carter wasn't going to polish his rough edges or sweeten his lyrics just to get radio play. He had built his career on truth, and he wasn't about to start lying now. The irony was painful. The very thing that made Clarence Carter great, his honesty, was also what limited his opportunities. In a world increasingly obsessed with image, Clarence stood as he always had, a blind black man from Montgomery with a growl in his throat and stories too raw for the mainstream. By the mid-1970 seconds, Clarence was still a respected artist, still recording, still selling, but the cracks were beginning to show. The Grammy on his shelf didn't protect him from the industry's shifting tastes. The millions of records sold didn't shield him from critics who dismissed his work as vulgar. And his perfectionism in the studio couldn't stop radio stations from turning the dial toward funk and disco. Clarence Carter was caught in a paradox, praised and scorned, loved by fans and ignored by gatekeepers. He wasn't fading yet, but the battle lines were drawn. Ahead lay a decade of struggle, reinvention, and resilience. For the moment, though, Clarence held fast, determined to keep singing the truth, no matter who wanted to hear it. By the mid-1970 seconds, Clarence Carter's path grew steeper. The sound of soul music, once the heartbeat of the charts, was shifting into something slicker and more commercial. Funk was exploding with deep grooves and dance floor energy, while disco was rising like a tidal wave, promising glitter, strings, and endless rhythm. For artists like Clarence, raw, gritty, and unapologetically Southern, the tide was unforgiving. His later Atlantic releases still carried the trademark Carter punch. Songs like Backdoor Friend and If You Can't Beat 'Em brimmed with humor, sexuality, and Southern swagger. But they didn't land on the charts with the same force as Slip Away or Patches. The audience was there, loyal and eager, but the industry's spotlight had swiveled away. Record executives who once chased his sound now chased disco queens like Donna Summer and polished groups like Earth, Wind, and Fire. Clarence Carter, with his raspy voice and scandalous lyrics, felt increasingly like a man out of time. By 1974, Clarence left Atlantic. He tried his hand with other labels, ABC Records, Venture, but none seemed to know what to do with him. Clarence wasn't interested in reinventing himself as a disco act or toning down his image to fit a smoother. To him, if soul had to be repackaged with shiny strings and orchestral sweeps to sell, then it wasn't soul anymore. He wasn't about to compromise for the sake of fashion. Without the machinery of a major label behind him, Clarence leaned into what had always sustained him: the stage. He toured relentlessly, hitting the black club circuit across the South and Midwest, playing county fairs, military bases, juke joints, and casinos. These weren't glamorous gigs. There were no flashing lights, no network television cameras, but they were real. In sweaty rooms filled with working-class fans, Clarence thrived. He gave the people what they came for: laughter, grit, and songs that spoke directly to their lives. Night after night, he sang Slip Away for couples holding each other tight, Patches for those who knew the pain of losing too much too soon, and his newer, nastier songs for crowds ready to dance and laugh their way. He was no longer chasing Grammy stages. He was giving truth to the people who still believed in him. In that sense, he never stopped being Clarence Carter. Behind the music, his personal life mirrored the highs and lows of his career. He married and divorced, raised children, and carried the burden of navigating the world as a blind man without the cushion of constant industry support. He lost friends and collaborators along the way. The deaths of contemporaries like Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, and Marvin Gaye were sobering reminders of how fragile fame and life could be. Clarence survived, but survival often meant sacrifice financially, emotionally, and creatively. The industry's treatment of black artists in his generation added salt to the wound. Many had signed exploitative contracts that stripped them of publishing rights and master recordings. Clarence was no. His greatest songs slip away, too weak to fight. Patches lived larger lives than he did, covered, sampled, and replayed for decades, often without him seeing the true rewards. It was the brutal reality of the business. When you were hot, you were embraced. When the hits slowed, you were forgotten, your legacy siphoned off by contracts that gave away the very music you created. And yet, Clarence Carter was not bitter. He was realistic. He understood the rules of the game, even if they were unfair. When you're hot, he once reflected, and when you're not, they forget you ever were. That honesty cut to the core of his philosophy. Fame was fleeting. What lasted was the connection between singer and audience, between voice and ear. By the late 1970 seconds, Clarence's mainstream presence had faded, but he remained a working artist. While disco ballads topped the charts and funk bands filled arenas, Clarence kept grinding in the spaces that welcomed him. He wasn't trying to reinvent himself as something he wasn't. He wasn't going to smooth his rough edges or trade his storytelling for glitter. He was Clarence Carter, raspy, unfiltered, sometimes vulgar, always real. It was a gamble that cost him chart positions and industry prestige, but it also preserved his authenticity. And authenticity was the currency that would carry him through the lean years and set him up for one of the most unexpected comebacks in soul history. The world might have left him behind, but Clarence Carter wasn't finished yet. His most outrageous, unforgettable chapter was still to come. By the early 1980 seconds, Clarence Carter was largely off the radar. The mainstream industry that had once celebrated Patches and Slip Away no longer had room for his brand of sweaty Southern soul. Disco had risen and fallen, funk had morphed, and a new generation of R&B acts dominated the airwaves. For many, Clarence Carter was a relic of another era, a name buried in record bins, remembered mostly by loyal fans across the South. But Clarence wasn't finished. In 1985, he recorded a song that would not only resurrect his career but also etch his name into pop culture in a way no one could have predicted. That song was Strokin. From the very first line, Strokin was unapologetic. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. Over a thumping bass line and bluesy groove, Clarence laid it out plain. "I be strokin', that's what I be doin'." The track was part sex anthem, part comedy sketch, part blues confession. It sounded like something you might hear blasting from a juke joint at midnight, the kind of song designed to make people laugh, blush, and dance all at once. Mainstream radio wouldn't touch it. MTV wouldn't air it. Record stores didn't know how to the lyrics were too explicit, the humor too raw, and the man behind it, a 9-year-old blind soul singer from Montgomery, wasn't the marketable face the industry wanted to promote. By conventional wisdom, Strokin should have died in obscurity. But Clarence Carter didn't need the industry's permission to succeed. Released on Ichiban Records, a small Atlanta-based label catering to Southern soul and blues artists ignored by the majors, Strokin spread like wildfire through the underground. DJs at black clubs and community radio stations across the South and Midwest picked it up. Bootleg tapes circulated like contraband. At barbecues, strip clubs, and bachelor parties, the song became an anthem. People didn't just want to hear Strokin, they needed it. It was funny, liberating, and undeniably catchy. In a world that often sanitized music for mass consumption, Clarence was giving audiences something honest, dirty, and real. By the early 1990 seconds, Strokin had become Clarence Carter's most requested song at every live show. Fans screamed along with every outrageous line, and Clarence leaned into it, adding raunchier ad-libs and encouraging the crowd to join the performance. The song never cracked the Billboard Hot 100, but its cultural footprint was enormous. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies through word of mouth alone, proving that Clarence Carter could still command a massive audience without radio or mainstream promotion. In 1993, he even performed Strokin on the Arsenio Hall show, and the audience went wild. For a brief moment, Clarence was a cult hero again, too dirty for prime time, too real for the airwaves, but beloved by millions. Behind the humor, Strokin carried something deeper. It was more than just a sex joke set to music. It was about freedom. Freedom to age without apology. freedom to speak plainly, freedom to embrace desire without shame. For Clarence, it was also a declaration of survival. He had been written off by the industry, forgotten by critics, and pushed aside by radio. Yet here he was, nearly 50 years old, blind, and long past his supposed prime, delivering a song that made America laugh, blush, and dance again. Ironically, it was the very thing that made him a pariah in the mainstream, the bluntness, the raunchiness, the refusal to sanitize that made him immortal. Strokin became a rite of passage in Southern nightlife, a staple of cookouts, a track whispered about in jokes and shouted in choruses. And as hip-hop grew, it found new life in samples, remixes, and references. Clarence Carter had managed the impossible. He made himself unforgettable at a time when the world, for all the ups and downs of his career, Strokin was proof that Clarence Carter's greatest gift was his refusal to compromise. He sang the truth as he saw it, whether that truth made you cry with Patches or laugh with Strokin. And in the process, he carved out a legacy not defined by awards or industry recognition, but by connection, real, raw. By the 1,990 seconds, Clarence Carter had lived through the rise and fall of soul, outlasted disco, sidestepped the MTV era, and pulled off a comeback that no one saw coming. Yet, despite the cultural footprint of Strokin, the mainstream music industry still seemed determined to leave him behind. While retrospectives and award shows honored his contemporaries, Clarence Carter's name was rarely mentioned. No Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, no Hollywood Walk of Fame star, no Grammy tributes, just silence. But in that silence, Clarence Carter kept working. He continued to tour tirelessly across the South, performing at casino circuits, blues festivals, and county fairs. Sometimes he played for packed houses, other times for a few dozen loyal fans. No matter the size of the crowd, microphone in one hand, cane in the other, he delivered performances with the same grit and humor that had defined him since the 1,960 seconds. For those who came to see him, Clarence wasn't a forgotten relic. He was family, the soundtrack of Sunday mornings, Saturday nights, heartbreaks, and celebrations. His later albums, released on smaller independent labels, rarely made waves with critics, but they resonated with titles like Live with the Doctor, Southern Soul, and Dance to the Blues reflected an artist who never stopped creating. Clarence never reinvented himself for the sake of fitting trends. He didn't chase nostalgia tours or try to clean up his image for younger audiences. He stayed true to his lane, even as the world around him shifted. Meanwhile, his influence seeped into modern music, often without acknowledgement. Hip-hop producers sampled his work. His raunchy humor was echoed in Miami bass remixes by Luke, while 2 Live Crew and countless others borrowed his unapologetic rawness. Even pop and R&B artists carried his DNA. Beyoncé's Rocket, with its slow, seductive Southern drawl, carried echoes of Clarence's style. Neo-soul singers like Anthony Hamilton and D'Angelo reflected the same ability to sing about lust, loneliness, and love without apology. Clarence Carter's fingerprints were everywhere, even if his name wasn't. What critics often missed was that Clarence's legacy was never just about music, sales, or awards. His songs were emotional lifelines. Patches became a hymn for families who had faced too much responsibility too soon. Slip Away gave voice to the quiet pain of forbidden love. And Strokin reminded people that laughter and pleasure had a place in the story of his catalog wasn't polished, but it was real, and that's why it endured. In his personal life, Clarence lived modestly in Montgomery, Alabama, the same city where his story had begun. He didn't flaunt wealth or fame. Reports of his net worth varied, but it was clear he never amassed the fortune his hits might have deserved. Like so many black artists of his generation, exploitative contracts and murky ownership of publishing rights meant the money often went elsewhere. But Clarence seemed at peace with that reality. He had a son, Clarence Carter Jr., and a small circle of family and collaborators. Unlike many celebrities, there were no public estate battles or scandals. His life outside the spotlight was quiet, dignified. Yet the emotional estate he left behind was immense. His songs became part of black Southern identity music that didn't flinch from the realities of poverty, sex, heartbreak. For blind teenagers searching for courage, his story proved that disability didn't have to mean invisibility. For church kids sneaking his records, Clarence showed that music could be both sacred and scandalous, holy and raunchy, all at once. Even without institutional recognition, Clarence Carter's legacy endured in the people who kept listening. His voice still echoes on Southern radio stations, in dusty record shops, and in DJ sets for those who know where real soul lives. Younger audiences rediscovered him through YouTube reaction videos, viral TikToks, and crate-digging hip-hop producers looking for a sample with grit. Clarence Carter never stopped being relevant, not because the industry said so, but because real listeners refused to let him fade. In the end, Clarence Carter's story wasn't about mainstream fame. It was about survival, honesty, and connection. He may not have received the awards or tributes he deserved, but he left behind something money and recognition can't buy. A body of work that continues to speak to people across generations. Whether it was a tear shed for Patches or a laugh shouted along with Strokin, Clarence Carter's truth lives on. He was blind from birth, yet he saw the truths of life clearer. From the moment Clarence Carter opened his mouth to sing, he forced people to feel, sometimes with tears streaming from Patches, sometimes with laughter and blushes from Strokin. His story was never neat or polished, but it was always honest. And that honesty is why his music still resonates today. Clarence Carter's journey was a paradox. He sold millions of records, won a Grammy, and penned songs that crossed race, class, and geography. Yet he never received the industry's highest honor. No star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, no induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, no Lifetime Achievement Award. In the eyes of the mainstream, he remained a footnote. But in the hearts of those who listened, he was unforgettable. His legacy lives not in statues or plaques, but in people. In the fathers who saw themselves in Patches, in the couples who held each other close to slip away, in the generations who laughed, danced, and shouted, in the countless artists who borrowed his grit, his sensuality, his refusal to apologize for who he was. Clarence Carter's truth found its way into every corner of American music, even when his name didn't. And that raises the question, what do we owe Clarence Carter? Was he underrated because he was too real, too unwilling to compromise, too much himself for a system built on polish and packaging? Or was he simply overlooked by a history that prefers tidy legends to complicated truths? What we know is this: Clarence Carter gave the world everything, his pain, his humor, his heart, and was given too little. His name may never shine in neon lights, but his voice still echoes in the places that matter most.